While still in government, I used to think that Canadian business just didn't see the folly of its ways. Very arrogant kind of bureaucratic attitude. And to a large extent, public policy has remained based on some version of that hypothesis, focusing on ramping up R&D performance. Indeed, that seems to have been the underlying assumption of the R&D-focused mandate for the Jenkins panel, i.e., if only we could effectively fine-tune R&D and related programs, Canadian business would realize what was good for them and adopt innovation-based strategies. And so here's the all-familiar picture that has vexed policymakers for many years. You can see it's pretty graphic, the decline in business expenditures on R&D relative to GDP. Now you notice that peak in 2000 is post-tech bubble bursting. Nortel itself has a lot to do with that. But notwithstanding that, the direction has still been down. With that as background, my paper tries to do three things. It outlines the recommendations in the Jenkins Report and the policy responses since then. It analyzes the reasons behind our poor innovation performance, and then it provides some policy prescriptions based on that analysis. Let me start today, though, with the diagnosis, and then go on to how the Jenkins Report recommendations and government policy have responded. The penny actually dropped for me in 2009 on this issue, when I was asked to review a draft of a study by the Council of Canadian Academies on why Canada falls short on business innovation. An important finding in that study was a counterintuitive chart, at least counterintuitive to me, that compared Canadian and American profits over an extended period of time. The part on the left is from that actual report, and the part on the right is updated data based on work that the IRPP has helped with. But regardless of the timeline, it shows very clearly that Canada, in aggregate, has outperformed the U.S. in profitability of its firms. So that leads to an inevitable conclusion is, well, how did that ever happen? And the evidence suggests to me that business behavior has been, in fact, eminently rational. I started out by saying I thought they didn't know what they were doing, but no, this confirms, look, we've been more profitable than our American counterparts. So what's wrong with this? Good outcomes without risky investments. What's not to like? The Council of Canadian Academies, and by the way, I keep referring to them because they, to me, are the intellectual force behind a lot of this work. They concluded in a follow-up study in 2013 on the same subject that Canadian business has been only as innovative as it needs to be, settling into what they called a low innovation equilibrium. So then the question is, well, okay, well, how did that happen? And of course, the answers are no doubt very complex. But in my view, fundamentally, it can be attributed to a lack of competitive pressure in many product markets because of the, I would guess, unintended consequences of microeconomic policy choices in the past, such as outdated ownership restrictions in key sectors, and paradoxically, NAFTA-driven economic integration, which was supposed to be good for Canada, and it has been, except that we end up in many areas being the comfortable junior partner to the Americans. So that's where we are, and then you say, well, okay, so what's wrong with that? we're the junior partner, but we're doing very well. Well, there's one big problem. It's not sustainable. Our Goldilocks situation is being disrupted at a very inopportune time in our economic history. So by disrupted, I mean that this tsunami of competitive change from what Charles Schwab of the World Economic Forum dubs as the fourth industrial revolution is coming at us. And by an inopportune time, I mean that the only sustainable source of Canada's future economic growth will be productivity improvement. Now, think about that for a minute. We were able to get away with relatively poor productivity performance for the last 30, 40 years as it's been declining, but we've been buttressed by three main forces in kind of rolling succession. First, very high rates of labor force growth, mainly because of female participation rates going up starting in the 70s. Secondly, huge trade growth, mainly with the United States, because of FTA, NAFTA. And that's tailed off very dramatically. And more recently, high resource rents. And you know what's happened with that. So there's not much left except a productivity-based growth strategy. Now, the only problem with that is look where we're starting from. So this chart shows Canada versus US, really our main comparator in most cases. And we're down about, looks around about 75% of US levels. Interestingly, more or less where the exchange rate is these days. But if you start actually disaggregating the productivity numbers, it gets more interesting. So this table shows that of the three components of productivity, labor, capital, and this thing that economists call multi-factor productivity. Well, multi-factor productivity is just a fancy way of saying innovation, really. It's know-how. It's how you combine those other two factors. You can see that what's really been dragging down our productivity performance has been MFP, or innovation. And if we had an updated chart of that, it would show that since the year 2000, MFP has made no contribution to growth in Canada, zero. It's actually slightly negative, but we'll call it zero because of the rounding. So what this tells me, if you want a growth strategy, that the new federal government is right about the centrality of innovation to long-term growth. Now, before we get on to solutions, there's one more problem, and it's a big one. We seem to have had the wrong diagnosis. So low R&D, an input measure, is merely a symptom of poor innovation, an outcome. And what's the evidence of turning the conventional assumption of causality on its head? Well, first of all, R&D is not even highly correlated to innovation. Work undertaken by the OECD found that 80% of businesses do not undertake R&D but are highly innovative. Innovation is as much about process redesign and new organizational marketing approaches as it is about technological inputs. It really reflects more about how businesses innovate today than what we remember from yesteryear, such as high R&D costs for pharmaceutical companies or aerospace companies. Now, if you don't believe me, you can believe this guy. And I can say to you that Apple is not unique. They're not a kind of a standalone. They figured this out, and no one else has. Many, many companies, and if we ever had time, I could give you some personal anecdotes about how other companies have been highly innovative innovative without any specific R&D input to that process. So where does that leave the Jenkins Report? So to their credit, the authors recognized the scale and scope challenges for high-growth Canadian gazelles, I think, as you called it, Tom, and tailored their recommendations to facilitating their chances of success. So here are the 6 recommendations. I won't go through them all. Not all have been adopted by government. Some have been partially. But I think the really important thing to say about Tom's report is that despite its narrow mandate, it tried to bust out of the strictures of R&D to broaden its remit to non-R&D initiatives, such as the proposal to build innovation objectives into procurement policy and to assist further in de-risking growth financing. And by the way, the recommendations on R&D made some sense, shifting from indirect support to more direct incentives like other OECD countries, repurposing the NRC. And when you look at all of the recommendations as a whole, they were really targeted at assisting these high-growth firms to get up to scale. And I think that's an important message from that report. All right, since the Jenkins Report, well, over several budgets, mainly 2012 to 2014, the previous government partially implemented the main substantive recommendations. Vis-a-vis R&D support, reorienting the NRC, facilitating increased risk capital, pilot procurement program. The new Liberal government, in its first budget, made what I would call a down payment on some measures to boost business innovation, notably strengthening innovation networks and clusters and helping high-impact firms scale up. The government promised that the full innovation agenda would unfold over the next year or so, and there's, as you all know, a lot of activity in that regard. So what's my advice for that agenda? Well, frankly, it's not about allocating ever more resources to business R&D, as it doesn't address the fundamental reasons for low innovation and will not in itself improve results. Now, here's somebody famous, and I don't know for sure whether he actually said this, but it sounds more like Yogi Berra than it does Albert Einstein. But if you keep doing the same thing, you will get the same results. So that's one of the reasons I'm saying enough already with the R&D support. Not that it's unimportant, but don't make that the focus of your policy. And I would argue that we need to shift from the old R&D-centric supply-push model to a demand-pull model where governments influence market conditions through a combination of microeconomic carrots and sticks that provide incentives to adopt innovation-based strategies. So here's my list, which is in the paper. First, go with the flow of the coming industrial revolution. Frankly, the market will do most of the heavy lifting. You know, business will respond. It is going to be sink or swim in many product areas. And, you know, governments will be largely bystanders unless they focus public policies on better equipping businesses with support that works. Now, here's maybe the most controversial part of this, at least based on the bit of press coverage that I've seen so far, means promoting rather than hindering market competition, beginning with a systematic review of discriminatory trade, investment, and regulatory policies. Now, this harks back to the Wilson Report, much of which is still kind of in abeyance. I should also mention, quite fortuitously, this morning, the Globe and Mail published an article on the recent OECD study on Canada. And one of the headline quotes from the article is that it says Canada's lagging productivity growth and innovation could get a meaningful boost by removing barriers to competition in network sectors such as telecom and broadcasting. And in fact, it estimated that the increased competition in the domestic market could generate about 0.5% per year in additional productivity growth. So I don't know anybody at the OECD anymore, so this is totally independent, but they take exactly the same perspective. So the second thing is to focus more on demand-side instruments while still promoting the broader public interest. Now that's hard stuff, by the way. I mean, it's easy to say, it's very hard to do, particularly when you get into the area of regulatory policy. But I think governments have a huge opportunity. If climate change is going to be seriously addressed, the regulation will be critical, and hopefully you can do the regulation in such a way as that you can actually provide incentives for firms to innovate. And then on the supply side, I guess the one thing I'd say about R&D, I think we need a more transparent and evidence-based approach to designing these programs. When I looked around, I found that the only publicly available evaluation of the in excess of $3 billion we spend annually on R&D tax credits is almost 20 years old. And it was a pretty thin document to begin with. So that's, I think, in terms of maybe Treasury Board's function, something that you want to look at. That's a huge expenditure without any real evidence base. Secondly, focusing increasingly on key non-R&D drivers of innovation. So I think the two are critical there. Highly skilled people, or increasing skills generally of the working population, and high growth financing. And then finally, reinforcing innovation ecosystems featuring sectoral and regional clusters. You might note that the new government has actually been talking about some of those areas, so I find that encouraging. So where does that leave us, finally? Well, I'm guardedly optimistic. So the optimistic part is that the Jenkins Report actually provided us with an important policy objective: to scale up high-growth Canadian businesses, as well as providing some key non-R&D tools. Further, the new federal government, as I said, its first budget made some interim initiatives in these areas. I say also guarded because the real challenge for governments lie in getting our various marketplace rules aligned to support rather than hinder innovation. That's really tough stuff. And it often means doing battle with vested interests that prefer the relative comfort of the status quo. So good luck with that. Anyway, that's the end of my comments, and thank you very much.